Welcome to the Plato Paradigm, a paradigm shift in reading Plato's dialogues. Episode 142, Meno 96e to 97a. Given that virtue is not something teachable, Meno asked the appropriate question, how do good men come about? And Socrates suggested that they may have made a mistake in an earlier conversation when they suggested that episteme, understanding or knowledge, is what guides people to correct and good action. This earlier conversation followed the hypothesis that if virtue is something teachable, it must be episteme, since episteme is what is taught. In addition, because arete, virtue, is the characteristic of a good person, the episteme must be beneficial. It must lead to beneficial acts. However, the moment this point is reached, Socrates substitutes for episteme phronesis, which is either all of virtue or one part of virtue, being one of the four cardinal virtues. This is what Socrates himself says, that it is either the whole of virtue or a part of it. We translate phronesis, following Cicero, as prudence. Socrates shows, or rather he asks Meno, and Meno agrees all the time, that when virtues are used correctly under the guidance of prudence, then the resulting actions are correct and good. But if imprudence guides these virtues, the resulting actions are bad and incorrect. The same goes for external goods, such as health and wealth. If phronesis, prudence, guides the use of these things, then the results are good and correct. But if imprudence guides, then the results are bad and incorrect. Socrates now, when referring back to that discussion, mentions episteme, but not phronesis. And in a way he is correct, because according to that hypothesis, virtue, in order to be something teachable, has to be a type of episteme, which would mean in that argument that prudence is a type of episteme. But all of this apparently is wrong, because we have come to the conclusion that there are no teachers or students of virtue, which proves that virtue is not something teachable. Meno still hasn't got it. If Socrates were to be arguing logically here, he might have said our problem was that we decided that what was taught was episteme, because teachers don't actually teach understanding. Understanding has to come from the students themselves. What teachers teach is opinion, or doxa. Whenever a student learns something from a teacher, the student only learns what the teacher says, and this forms a thought. And the thought is not understanding, it's simply an opinion. This is in fact what Meno learns from Gorgias, whether directly or indirectly through his lover Aristippus, the one Socrates mentions as a student, while Meno is not mentioned as a student. However, Meno has all of the answers that Gorgias has given, but these answers are not understanding, they are not knowledge, they are opinions. Each of the answers the slave gives in the exercise over geometry, each of the answers is an opinion, But altogether, all of the series of opinions and refutations, all of that leads to one conclusion, which is, in the long run, understanding or knowledge about on which line one is to build a square double the area of the original square. That is, knowledge is a complex of opinions and therefore much harder to overturn. Any individual opinion is easy to refute. However, Socrates is not arguing logically because he's talking to a person like Meno who does not understand logic. Therefore, Socrates is going to argue for something else, that they thought that the only thing which could guide people to correct and good actions is episteme, actually phronesis, and now he's going to say that actually there's something else which can guide just as well. We left Socrates last time saying that because they had thought that episteme was the thing which guided people to good and correct actions, this stopped them, prevented them from finding out the true way in which good men become good. Meno, of course, is clueless. Pos tuto leges, O Socrates. How do you mean this, Socrates? Of course, Meno also jumps on the opportunity to listen yet again to another story from Socrates. Hode, hotimentus agathus andras de ophelimus enai, orthos homologecamen tutoge hoti ucan alos echoi, egar? Nai. In this way, that good men need to be beneficial, we have agreed correctly to this, that there could be no other situation. Isn't that so? Yes. This is already problematic, or problematic yet again, because this is something Socrates had asked the previous time. There is no compelling reason for something good to be beneficial. Someone can be good at an activity and yet not be beneficial. Someone beneficial has to be good for a purpose, and usually that purpose is also considered good. Someone who is good for a bad end is normally considered harmful. Since Meno has agreed to this, Socrates carries on. Kai hotige ophelimoi esontai, an orthos hemin hegon taiton pragmaton, kai tutopu kalos homologumen. Nai. And that they will be beneficial if they lead us in affairs correctly. This too, we agreed finally, yes. This is outrageously wrong, and yet Meno agrees as if that is what was said at the time. This is absolute nonsense. Episteme, or later phronesis, understanding, or later prudence, was considered to be the thing which, when present, guided the individual to good and correct acts. Now Socrates is saying that what was said then was that good men, if they're going to be beneficial, guide us correctly. And this is absolute nonsense. Meno accepts it because he himself is a general, someone who guides people, or in a military context, someone who leads people. It's the same verb. And clearly Meno regards himself as a good leader. So of course he's going to agree with this. It's just that he lacks the ability to recollect what has been said in the dialogue previously. Hotit uk estin orthos hegestai an me phronimos tuto homoioiesmen uk orthos homologekosin. Poste leges. But that there isn't leading correctly if someone isn't prudent, obviously it means the leader. If the leader isn't prudent, then the leading isn't done correctly. In this, we are similar to people who have agreed incorrectly. How do you mean? When Socrates had talked about episteme and then phronesis earlier, he hadn't mentioned anything about the person having phronesis being phronimos, although this is the case in Greek. Someone who has prudence is prudent. But Socrates hadn't been talking about a prudent leader. He had been talking about prudence, leading someone to correct and good actions. Is Meno asking about this? Is he saying, what do you mean we didn't say that? Probably not, because he hasn't said anything like that until now. So what is his problem? Why does he say, what do you mean? It seems that his problem is that someone who leads correctly, just the way that Meno himself does as a general in the army, he considers himself prudent. And here's Socrates saying, no, here we agreed incorrectly. Actually, a leader who leads correctly isn't prudent. And this does sound a bit strange to anybody, but it would even sound somewhat offensive to Meno. He might even take this personally. This is very often the case in argument, where one side is trying to make an argument which follows from all of the previous discussion, but the other side, who thinks is following, suddenly hears something offensive and takes exception. In other words, it's easier to pick out something immediate and exclusive from an argument than to follow the whole argument over time and in all of its complexity. We should also not ignore the fact that Socrates is perverting yet another account which has already been made in the dialogue, and we can see why he does it. It's in order to test Meno, but we should also learn from this that we can never ever trust anything Socrates says, precisely because he says what he says for the benefit of his interlocutor. When I say for the benefit of the interlocutor, it's not to give him knowledge. That is impossible. It is to try to make the audience, his interlocutor, sit up and think and say, wait a minute, that isn't what we said. That is what dialectic is about. And that, if at all, is what recollection is about.